I would like to welcome you to Cranbrook Art Museum, both our in-house audience as well as those watching online tonight live as we live stream this on our YouTube channel, DeSalle Auditorium. I'm Andrew Blauvelt, the director of Cranbrook Art Museum, and it's actually been a very long time since we've had a public program here in DeSalle. And so we're very pleased to be able to return to at least some aspect of public programming live and to also be able to feature our speakers on the live stream. We're now just beginning to introduce our fall exhibition season, which includes the exhibition that's on view outside of this room in the lower level of the museum, James Hefner, Michigan Modern. So I hope you'll have a chance to check that out, either before this talk you did or after the talk this evening, featuring about 50 photographs that document various aspects and examples of modernism, a modern architecture in the state of Michigan, which was the subject of a book. It came out of doing the book, A Michigan Modern Architectural Legacy, and that was with Brian Conway, and we were also many years ago hosting an exhibition of the same title here at Cranbrook Art Museum back, I think, in 2014, before my time. But that was an amazing exhibition actually done in collaboration with the University of Michigan School of Architecture, the College of Architecture. I would also like to note that James Hefner, the photographer, and Brian Conway, the author of that book, will be speaking here, again, both live and online on November 4th at 6 p.m., and that one is at 6 p.m., not 7, here in the auditorium, so please make note of that. And then we'll be also presenting another related topic, which we have a companion exhibition outside called Building Cranbrook, Saarinen in Michigan. And that exhibition also features photographs of the Cranbrook campus and the buildings by James Hefner. And I'll be in conversation with Kevin Atkinson, who's the curator for the Center for Collections and Research here at Cranbrook. And we're just devising our repartee for that engagement. So I think that'll be something to look forward to if you're interested in those projects and anything related to architecture this season. I'd also like to invite you to the opening of the fall exhibitions, which will be celebrated all together on Friday, October 29th from 6 to 9 p.m. at the museum here. And you can register online. If you're not a member, you can please join and support the work of the museum. So for tonight, I'm very pleased to welcome to Cranbrook Art Museum artist Justin Beal, whose book, Sandfuture, is available upstairs at our front desk for purchase, and hopefully some of you have had a chance to read it. I was able to read it a few weeks ago because it's just been published, and it was an amazing journey, an odyssey, I would say, and the narrative is equally as inventive. The narrative structure of the book and the spine of the book, of course, is the life and work of Minoru Yamasaki. But intertwined with that is a kind of reflection on contemporary architecture and contemporary urbanism, especially in New York City after 9/11 and after the Sandy hurricane. So it's quite an interesting and artistic weaving together of all of those elements that will, I'm sure, give us more enlightenment around all of that. Justin is an artist, as I said, who's exhibited extensively in the United States and Europe. He graduated from Yale University with a degree in architecture and continued his studies at the Whitney Independent Study Program at the University of Southern California. Justin's work has been reviewed in the New York Times, the New Yorker, Art Forum, Frieze, Art in America, and the Los Angeles Times, and is included in the permanent collections of the Albright Knox Museum in Buffalo, the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles. Beal teaches at Hunter College. Please help me welcome Justin Beal.
Thank you, Andrew, for that introduction and also for the exhaustive tour of the Cranbrook campus, which was gorgeous. I also want to thank Jonathan Massey for co-hosting with Michigan, and for everyone who's helped setting up, Sarah, Laura, Katie. It's been wonderful to be here today. I also would like to thank my friend Bobby Taubman, who can't be here tonight, but who has sort of been my ambassador to the city of Detroit. And I can't imagine a better ambassador. And with Bobby in mind, I would like to dedicate this talk to Julie Taubman, who was a great supporter of Yamasaki's work and a friend of mine, and whose passion for design, I think, was an inspiration to all of us who knew her. So 4 years ago, I thought I was going to be spending a lot of time in Detroit. I was coming back and forth to visit the archives at Wayne State, and then suddenly my research was interrupted by COVID, which sort of forced me into more unorthodox practices. But the good news is I got to spend enough time in the archive to get to know Yamasaki a lot better. And now that I'm back, which I'm excited to be, there are a few buildings that I never got to see inside, which I'm going to try to remedy tomorrow. But I'm excited to talk to an audience here that is more familiar with Yamasaki's work than most of the audiences I've spoke to thus far. And and with that, I will begin. I'm going to read a brief excerpt to start that pertains both, as Andrew explained, the book kind of jumps back and forth between Yamasaki's story and a story of the narrator character who very much resembles myself. And this passage has to do with my own architectural education and with some of the changes in Yamasaki's style in his mid-career. As criticism of Yamasaki's new direction was growing, an irreverent young critic named Ada Louise Huxtable wrote in Art in America that if modern architecture may be said to have already established a tradition, Yamasaki is shattering it. With a remarkable sensitivity to the moment, she acknowledged how, to a generation of architects trained in doctrines of ornament is crime, form follows function, and less is more, this is close to aesthetic transgression. Huxtable takes pains to defend a practice which, while deliberately decorative and among professionals highly controversial, is also sensitive, conscientious, exploratory, delicately sensuous, and very beautiful. Within months, Huxtable would assume her post as the first full-time architecture critic at the New York Times, and for the next decade she would remain a stalwart supporter of Yamasaki's work. Huxtable, however, was increasingly in a minority, for the delicacy and ornamentation of Yama's work did not fit easily into the dominant narrative of American architectural history, which has generally organized itself around a central virtue of strength. This narrative was largely the construction of architectural historians like Vincent Scully, who arranged the history of American architecture into a seamless, monolithic mythology of powerful, grounded structures rising up from the earth. The Aztec pyramids at Teotihuacan, the stone skyscrapers of Chicago, the austere concrete minimalism of Louis Kahn. While not the only story of American architecture, Scully's was a monumentally influential one. He taught at Yale for over 60 years and published dozens of books based on his lectures. The breadth of his influence on architects and critics and historians who first saw modern architecture through his eyes is formidable. Scully's lectures were also the first architecture courses I ever took, and I felt at times as though the entirety of my architectural education was built on the foundation of his worldview, not only because he taught me, but because he taught so many of the people who wrote the books I read or taught the courses I took. Scully, nearly 80 by the time I encountered him, with ruffled gray hair and tattered tweed, was the physical embodiment of patriarchal professorial knowledge. He would stand before an enormous auditorium filled to capacity with students and bombard us with a syncopated sequence of side-by-side images cast on the screen behind him from dual slide projectors. Each lecture began quietly on a solid historical footing, the Acropolis or a Pueblo village, and built gradually through a progression of steps so deliberate that they felt not only logical but inevitable. He would bang his broomstick pointer on the floor emphatically, or clench the dais and fight back tears as the lecture reached its inevitable crescendo, advancing images by shouting "slide" at the graduate student in the projection booth like a sea captain barking orders at his crew. His delivery transformed the loose threads of architectural history, embroidered with references to art and literature, into matters of thrilling political and intellectual urgency. Like any academic canon, Scully's chronology tells a story, but it's also just a story, and one that, favoring cohesiveness over completeness, puts undue emphasis on certain accomplishments, while omitting others entirely. Despite their shared interest in the architectural virtues of empathy and democracy, Yamasaki did not fit into the story Scully was trying to tell, so he was largely erased from it. Scully dismissed the McGregor Conference Center as a twittering aviary and largely ignored everything that came after it. The more time I spent with the work, the more I understood the extent to which I had to unlearn Scully's particular version of history before I could even begin to look at Yamasaki objectively. Yamasaki's marginalization was not entirely Scully's doing, to be sure, but the idea of strength, deployed in the context of a history that exists almost exclusively within the highly coded spaces of privilege, whiteness, and masculinity, inevitably carries the associations of all of its implied opposites. If a building is not strong, it is by implication frivolous, decorative, feminine, weak, mannered, exotic, or queer. So we begin there. So this is a talk about this book, Sandfuture, a book which I wrote, but which would not have existed without the collaboration of my editor, Tom Weaver, the designer, John Morgan, and the MIT Press, all of whom deserve some credit for its creation. The talk is also something of an experimental exercise in describing a quite non-linear book in a linear lecture. And so I'm going to jump around between topics as I do in the book. Much of the book is about this man, Minoru Yamasaki, but there are also parts of the book, half of it really, that are about other things: sick building syndrome, the contemporary art world, migraine, pharmaceutical architecture. So tonight I'm going to talk about Yamasaki, but I will also try to speak more broadly about the book as a whole, how it came to be, in the hopes that this discussion might be equally, if not more relevant, to those of you, particularly students, who are thinking about architecture, writing about architecture. When I graduated with an undergraduate degree in architecture and design in May of 2001, just over 20 years ago, I had no idea who Yamasaki was. After graduation, I moved into a cheap apartment 3 blocks below the World Trade Center in Manhattan. When I moved in, I was immediately consumed by the presence of these two buildings, shown here in a pair of photographs taken by Peter Hujar in 1976. They were spectacular. They may not have worked as buildings, but they were extraordinary as objects. And because I was a 20-year-old art student, I always carried a camera around with me, and I would go at night and sit in the plaza and drink beer and take photographs of them like this. I remember being surprised at the time by the fact that despite having just completed what was considered to be a very rigorous undergraduate architecture degree, I had no idea who designed them. It was during those first few weeks that I lived in that apartment that I began to connect the World Trade Center to Yamasaki, and then Yamasaki to the Eastern Airlines terminal at Logan Airport, which is a building that I loved as a child growing up in Boston because it was so unlike any other building in Boston, to the collapse of Pruitt-Igoe, which I, of course, had been taught, but nobody told me who designed the buildings, and later to buildings like Robertson Hall at Princeton or the Century Plaza Towers in Los Angeles. If you've probably already done the math, I only lived near the World Trade Center for a few weeks, and on the morning of September 11th, I left for work, and the sky was full of paper, and rather by accident, because I still had the camera with me, I took this photograph right as the United plane flew into the South Tower. This photograph's not in the book, and I've barely sort of shown it at all, but I didn't want to include it in the book because I felt like it would sort of detract from all the other beautiful images of Yamasaki's work. But I think in the context of the talk, it's a very important sort of origin document for this whole project. So now I'm going to jump from here forward 11 years to when the book begins. Like any tawdry piece of fiction, it begins on a dark and stormy night. this one in October 2012 as Hurricane Sandy is bearing down on the east coast of the United States. In the decade since 9/11, I had embarked on a moderately successful art career, which is how I'd come to meet my wife, Jane, on whom the character Nina is based. And she owned an art gallery on the low-lying western edge of Chelsea. When she and her partner were finally able to get into the space the next day, they found that the entire basement storage and much of the first floor gallery had flooded completely. As a result, I, along with many others, ended up spending several weeks dragging these dead, waterlogged kind of objects, which were made by very close friends of mine, out of the basement. These are photographs by John DeVola. It was a profound experience for me, and one that really kind of fundamentally changed my relationship to making objects. It happened at a point in my career when I had finally been able to make a living selling art, but the objects coming out of the studio were feeling less and less authentic or less sincere, and I wanted to do something different. And so I gave myself 2 years to finish the projects I'd already committed to and decided I was going to do a writing project. At first, that writing was going to be about sick building syndrome, a subject which, like Yamasaki, I felt had been inadequately addressed in my architectural education. But this interest in sick building syndrome was also kind of a logical outgrowth of the work that I was making at the time, which had mostly to do with the relationship between bodies and buildings and the sort of awkward interactions of the organic and the architectural. For as long as there have been buildings, they've been compared to bodies. The building is a body. That's why chimneys have throats. That's why vaults have ribs. That's why hinges have knuckles. That's why a tongue fits a groove. Indeed, 2,000 years of architectural history, beginning with Vitruvius, might easily be reduced to a gradual deterioration of the primacy of this humanist body-building analogy, culminating in a point in the late 20th century when buildings began to get sick. This is the moment that Jameson describes in The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism as the point at which architecture finally succeeded in transcending the capacities of the human body to locate itself in the external world. In other words, the point after which humanism becomes impossible. I've always been interested in that moment of collapse, in the way that it was embodied by the phenomenon of sick building syndrome, sort of in Reagan-era America. In part because sick building syndrome was a definable thing. It was a direct result of unregulated materials, insufficient ventilation, but it was always regarded as a marginal phenomenon, something psychosomatic or hysterical. And so it had never really been properly accounted for in architectural or medical discourse. But it always struck me as a very productive way of thinking about how bodies and buildings interact, in part because its name allows it to be simultaneously both an illness and a metaphor. I'm going to return to the idea of sick building later, but the point for the moment is that this interest in sick building syndrome led me on a tangent about architects who had struggled with chronic illness, which led me to Stornley Cracklight, the protagonist of Peter Greenaway's 1986 film, The Belly of an Architect. And Cracklight led me back to Yamasaki, who, as many of you may know, suffered first from severe ulcers and later, like Cracklight, from stomach cancer. And it was then, as I got deeper into Yamasaki's story, that I realized that the book I had begun to write needed to be not about sick building syndrome, but about him. Minoru Yamasaki was born in a cold water tenement in Seattle in 1912. He graduated from architecture school in Washington as the country was sliding into depression and moved to New York, where he eventually got a job working for Shreve, Lamb & Harmon on the Parkchester Apartments, the massive middle-income housing estate in the Bronx. It was pretty much the first American application of the European modernist tower in the park. Minoru met his wife, Terry, and they got married on Friday, December 5th, 1941. They spent the night dancing on the roof of the Astor Hotel, and then, on Sunday morning, the Japanese Navy bombed Pearl Harbor, and the ground shifted fundamentally beneath their feet. Because Yama was a US citizen and a good architect, he was able to continue working, and he was put in charge of designing a naval training base in upstate New York, where he was twice turned away at the gate by MPs who mistook him for a spy. Things were, of course, much worse on the West Coast, where 120,000 Japanese Americans, some 72,000 of whom were US citizens, were sent to internment camps. Yamasaki was able to move his parents to New York, where they shared a crowded apartment with him and his brother and his wife, and he continued to work for the government. He went on from there to work for Wallace Harrison and Raymond Loewy, and he nearly opened an office with George Nelson. In the summer of 1945, Nelson took a job at Herman Miller. The Americans bombed Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and Yamasaki accepted an offer from the Detroit-based firm and moved to Michigan. He eventually went out on his own with two co-workers, Joseph Lineweber and George Helmuth. Helmuth was well connected in St. Louis, and when Harry Truman passed the American Housing Act in 1949, Yamasaki and Helmuth got the job designing a massive new public housing complex called Pruitt-Igoe. Yamasaki proposed a variety of mixed-height buildings and row houses, insisting that nothing exceed 7 stories, but by the time the project was presented for federal approval, it had been reduced to nearly 33 nearly identical 11-story buildings, which had a lot to do with the specific requirements of Housing Act, federal housing. As construction progressed, the design continued to be undermined by value engineering and inflated construction costs, and one by one, the amenities were eliminated and materials were exchanged for cheaper alternatives. Yamasaki described the final result as tragically insensitive, but critics applauded it. An architectural forum called it the best high-rise apartment of the year. His next major project in St. Louis was a soaring concourse for the Lambert Air Terminal, a project that was a major success and included in Arthur Drexler's show Buildings for Business and Government at MoMA, a show that there was only 6 buildings in that show: Seagram's Building, the SOM, Naval Air Force Academy. In December of 1953, when Lambert was still under construction, doctors discovered that Yamasaki was bleeding internally. He underwent emergency surgery and remained in the hospital for 8 weeks, while surgeons removed 2/3 of his ulcerated stomach. He was working for a commission on the U.S. consulate in Kobe at the time, and doctors ordered him to take time off. So he decided to take a trip through Europe and Asia. In India, he went to Chandigarh, where he found Le Corbusier's government buildings too imposing for a young democracy. But he loved the Mughal forts at Fatehpur Sikri and the Taj Mahal, and the basic forms of Islamic ornament became an enduring influence on his work. When he returned to Detroit, he published 2 articles in Architectural Record outlining what would become his mature design philosophy. They're sincere, intuitive pieces of writing that arrive at the conclusion that monumental architecture is bad for democracy, and that the project of modernism, while it has extraordinary potential, had lost sight of the ways in which it was leaving the individual person and the individual body behind. Now I'm going to switch gears here and return to the parallel narrative of the book for a moment. A few days after the hurricane, I walked uptown. The flood served as a reminder of the fundamental way in which topography has informed the settlement of New York City. The wealthiest New Yorkers still live on the highest land, up away from the water, in the downtown marshland that had once been rampant with cholera and yellow fever. In this way, among others, illness has exerted a fundamental influence on the history of the architecture in the city. Long before sick building syndrome, one disease in particular became a foundational metaphor for early modernism. A compelling case, this is the Paimio Sanatorium by Alvar and Aino Alto. A compelling case has been made by a number of architectural historians, notably Beatrice Colomina, with whom some of you may be familiar, that every distinctive feature of modern architecture, the white walls, the wide windows, the roof gardens, the sterile surfaces, the conspicuous lack of ornament, can be traced back to the program of the sanatorium and medical prescriptions for the treatment of tuberculosis. Introducing the possibility that modernism might not be seen as a radical social movement so much as a radical medical experiment. It's a fascinating lens through which to consider 100 years of architectural history, but also one that tends to overlook two fundamental structural problems with the sanatorium. It was a treatment for a disease that disproportionately affected the working class that was available only to those who could afford not to work for months. And perhaps more importantly, it didn't work. And it was only until we discovered antibiotics that we actually were able to control the disease. Both problems raise larger questions about the accessibility and efficacy of modernism more generally. Back in Detroit, Yamasaki begins to design the first buildings in a style that is distinctly his own. And many of these will be familiar to all of you. The McGregor Memorial Conference Center at Wayne State, shown here in photographs by Balthazar Korab. This is the building that Scully referred to as a twittering aviary. This is the interior. Also, the regional headquarters of the Reynolds Metal Building, which I will confess is my favorite, I think, in part because of the way this was what was called a product building, and it was a building that was designed to sort of showcase aluminum, and because of that, he was able to sort of short circuit all these rules of functionalism and form follows function, because the purpose of the building was to demonstrate the versatility of aluminum. So any kind of amount of decoration or versatility was justified in the program. But you can also see the ways in which the image on the bottom right is a screen from the Fatehpur Sikri, and the way that that pattern kind of reemerges in the facade of the Reynolds Building, which, as you all probably know, is unfortunately now sitting somewhat derelict on the side of the highway. Another building from this time was the Saudi airfield, designed when Dhahran was largely an outpost for Saudi Aramco and the US military. A combination of traditional Arabic tracery and modernist form that would become a signature, both of Yamasaki's mature work and of the Saudi royal family embarking on an era of prolific nation building. King Saud considered the building the only building that looked like a Saudi building, and is pictured here on two Saudi notes that remained in circulation for over 20 years. This airport earned Yamasaki his fourth AIA honor in 8 years, outpacing rivals like Saarinen and SOM. But it was also an uneasy time in his life. He and Terry get divorced in 1961, and his interaction with his peers, which until that point had included correspondence with Bruno Zevi, Jane Jacobs, Buckminster Fuller, Neutra, Paul Rudolph, epic nights spent drinking with Wallace Harrison and Mies van der Rohe, became increasingly limited. And his new work was largely dismissed as too decorative. Rudolph called it mannerist, Venturi called it picturesque, Banham called it epicene, and I.M. called it capricious. Gordon Bunshaft later told Time magazine that Yamasaki was as much of an architect as I am Napoleon. He was an architect, but now he's nothing more than a decorator. It was in this moment of his career that a key figure rises to his defense. As I described in the excerpt at the beginning, Ada Louise Huxtable became a champion and sort of vociferously defended his work. I also just add to any architecture students who may be here, if you haven't spent a lot of time with Ada Louise Huxtable, you should. While Yamasaki was establishing himself in Detroit, David Rockefeller had a problem in New York. An exodus of white-collar workers from Wall Street and Midtown had become an issue for the Rockefeller family and Chase Bank, both of which held significant real estate in the financial district. So after consulting with his family friends, Bill Zeckendorf and Bob Moses, Rockefeller concluded that the long-term viability of downtown real estate would require a project of catalytic bigness. And in a small press conference in 1960, Rockefeller formally announced plans for a massive World Trade Center. It just happens that 2 weeks after that press conference, Rockefeller was also in attendance in the MoMA Sculpture Garden for the unveiling of Jean Tingley's Homage to New York, a massive mechanical sculpture that destroyed itself over the course of a 27-minute performance. I'm going to return to this event later. To realize his plan, Rockefeller needed the support of the Port Authority for 2 key reasons. The first was that the Port Authority by this point had access to more capital than the city. And the second was that they possessed the ability to seize property by eminent domain. The Port Authority agreed, but immediately dispensed with Rockefeller's Genius Committee of Architects, which was comprised of Edward Durrell Stone, Gordon Bunshaft, and Wallace Harrison, all of whom had built extensively for the Rockefeller family. The Port Authority set out to find a new architect, and to everyone's surprise, Minoru Yamasaki and associates rose to the top of a list that included I.M. Pei, Philip Johnson, Walter Gropius, based largely on the popular success of the Science Pavilion at the Seattle World's Fair. And in 1962, Yamasaki was still working on the Science Pavilion, but he was offered the job. Everything that I have read or heard from people suggests to me that he knew the project was something too big for him to take on, but he also knew he couldn't turn it down. Then, in January of 1963, the commission earned him a place on the cover of Time magazine. Sort of his sort of disembodied head floating over the Science Pavilion. And as many of you may know, this is a very rare honor for an architect, and most of the architects who have been on the cover of Time magazine are very common. Frank Lloyd Wright, Buckminster Fuller, Saarinen. So it was a hugely important moment, but also, as you can tell, it's titled "The Road to Xanadu." It opens with this image, not of his work, but of the Taj Mahal, and there's a kind of this, definitely a sort of Orientalist tone that overlays the entire article. There were very few details about the World Trade Center project at this point, but the article comes to a close with an auspicious assessment of the challenge that lay ahead. If Yamasaki can keep a firm control of the job, it will be one of the greatest opportunities ever presented to an architect. It was around the time of the hurricane that plans were first announced for 432 Park Avenue. I began following the building closely after a series of renderings were made public. 432 Park would be nearly 1,400 feet tall on a footprint barely 90 feet square. It would have 4 identical facades and a relentless grid of identical 10-foot square windows. Every 12 stories, as you can see in the rendering on the left, the openings are unglazed, and all the mechanicals for the building are contained within the cement cylinder rising kind of within the core of the building. No building so narrow, 15 times taller than it is wide, had ever been built in Manhattan before. And the exterior, designed by Raphael Vignoli, is kind of aggressively minimal. It's not a conceptual minimalism, it's kind of maximal minimalism, a boutique minimalism. It's the pure void repurposed as a marketing ploy. And if you kind of listen closely, you can hear Louis Kahn spinning in his grave. Before it was even built, the building felt to me and to others like something important, a largely unwelcome symbol of a moment. 432 Park's profile so fundamentally altered Midtown Manhattan skyline that the New York Mets and the New York Fire Department are said to have held special meetings to discuss modifying the skylines on their logos. That both declined to do so is a reflection of the city's reluctance to embrace this building entirely devoid of any cultural, civic, or kind of social function. This is not a building for New Yorkers. Its apartments are mostly owned by investors who will rarely use them. It is, to borrow a phrase from J.G. Ballard's novel High Rise, an environment built not for man, but for man's absence. And so I kept my eye on it. The pace of construction became a sort of marker of time as I was writing the book. Things were back to normal, the waters had receded, the gallery had reopened, My wife and I had a daughter. And so there I am, working on this book, which, to the best of my knowledge, was the first serious book on Yamasaki's work in 40 years. I was taking this leap. I had sabotaged my art career when I heard from a colleague that Yale was publishing a book about Yamasaki, and they were already finished. I don't know if Dale is here or if he's listening, but the book turned out to be an excellent, comprehensive monograph by historian Dale Geyer, which is really an essential resource that needed to exist for students and for historians and everyone. It's a great book. But when I first heard about it, it sent me into this kind of tailspin for a week or two. Until I realized it was one of those rare moments when a project kind of tells you what it wants to be. Because it was then that I realized I didn't want to write an architecture book. At least I wanted to write an architecture book that felt to me closer to the way that I experienced architecture. And that the only way for me to do that was for me to allow more of myself into the narrative. I think architecture is very personal, and by and large, architecture books are very impersonal. And the writing about architecture that's always resonated with me has come from outside of the field. Thomas Mann, Donald Barthelme, Susan Sontag, Teju Cole, Florence Nightingale, Victor Hugo, Louise Bourgeois, Tom Wolfe. I could go on and on. And this is actually an image from a piece I wrote recently about the kind of archetype of the architect in fiction and in cinema, which includes Light Years by James Salter. And if any of you are seriously considering being an architect, I urge you to read chapter 7 of Light Years. Just trust me. So it was then that I dispensed with this idea of trying to write like an architectural historian or a biographer or a journalist or an academic. And as I did, a system of connections began to emerge. Everything that was happening became kind of relevant to this project of writing about Yamasaki. The toxicity of my studio, the corporatization of the art world, a virtual tour I took of the Novartis campus, the sort of look and feel of a visit to an emergency room. And one of the most important of those connections was an ongoing conversation I was having with Jane, or Nina, about her struggle with chronic migraine. It was at that point that I reread Oliver Sacks's book, Migraine, and I got stuck on this one diagram, which sort of helped me to understand migraine as a spatial phenomenon. And I realized how much I had learned from her about her experience with the built environment that had allowed me to access both my understanding of sick building syndrome and also my understanding of Yamasaki's experience with chronic illness in a different way. And all these trends began to kind of blend together, and that's at the point at which the book really became itself. Neither the Port Authority nor Yamasaki began with the intention of designing the tallest building in the world. And there's a moment of research in the research process of this book that I think is interesting, which is that I kept trying. You think the Port Authority is the greatest bureaucracy in New York at the time. There must be minutes from every meeting. There must be notes on every interaction, records of every phone call, and there was nothing. And so I was trying to figure out this point at which it went from just being a big project to the biggest. And it wasn't until like 2 or 3 years into this research project where I realized that the entire archive of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, 75,000 volumes, 3 full-time librarians, was in the World Trade Center. So it's all gone. There's no records of what happened, which is kind of a staggering loss of information in terms of the infrastructure of New York City. But either way, what was clear was that at some point during a regular meeting in Yamasaki's office, the brief had changed, and he was now building the 2 tallest buildings in the world, and he wasn't happy about it. A year later, Yamasaki and Rockefeller posed together with this massive model of the 2 towers. And I think what's the most striking here, for those of you who are so familiar with Yamasaki's work, is it just doesn't look like the rest of his work. You can see the way in which all the details have been kind of engineered out, and these massive columns were what remained. Yamasaki had proposed a World Trade Center which, in his words, would become a living representation of man's belief in humanity and his need for individual dignity, with a plaza that would function like a Mecca, a great relief from the experience of the narrow streets and sidewalks of the surrounding area. A space with trees and water and pedestrian arcades, all of which got kind of value engineered out of the project. It never made it into the final design. In retrospect, his descriptions of the whole scheme seem kind of delusional or naive, and you can feel how that must have weighed on him. And he was back in the hospital and struggling to return to work as the project proceeded. Despite his own personal struggles with the project, the praise for the proposal was unanimous. Huxtable wrote that the World Trade Center promised to be the best new building that New York has seen in a long time. I'm trying to drink water at the moments where I'm making a jump, so you guys understand. The history of the tallest buildings in Manhattan tells a story of shifting geography of power in the city. At the beginning, there were temporary Lenape hunting shelters. Then the Dutch came and built a massive military fort. As they settled, churches like Collegiate and Trinity became the tallest structures on the island. And then, as time went on, buildings like Woolworth, Singer, Chrysler, and eventually the Empire State Building became these symbols of kind of commercial power. 40 years after the Empire State Building, the World Trade Center opened, which sort of symbolized this strange collusion of the public and private sector, of Chase Bank and the Rockefellers and the city and the Port Authority. Today, private residential towers are the tallest structures in Manhattan, suggesting something about where power resides now, in sort of personal wealth more than anything else. As planning proceeded on the World Trade Center, conditions were deteriorating at Pruitt-Igoe. The population of St. Louis, once forecast to increase steadily, plummeted by nearly a third between 1950 and 1970. The Housing Act, which had built Pruitt-Igoe, had also subsidized the highways and mortgages that lured much of the city's white middle class out to the suburbs. White flight and black sequestration radically altered the makeup of the city. The housing authority's financial model provided no contingency at Pruitt-Igoe for low occupancy. Without income from tenants, Pruitt-Igoe could not generate revenue to pay for basic maintenance. Infrastructure deteriorated, and all of those who could afford to gradually left. As a result, Pruitt-Igoe became what civil rights activist Joyce Ladner called a residence of last resort. Like Ibsen's master builder, Yamasaki was afraid of heights. In order to make an occupant of the World Trade Center feel comfortable, Yamasaki based the exact width of each window, 22 inches, on the span of his own shoulders, inscribing his own frame on the facade of the two buildings. His body had been pushed to a limit by this project, and he was back in the hospital again with employees shuttling plans to and from his bed. It was then that his romantic life took a final strange turn. After 8 years of divorce, Minoru and Terry remarried in 1969. As the buildings began to rise, they finally got to go on the honeymoon they were never able to take in 1945. The buildings began to take shape that summer. It was a summer of Stonewall and Woodstock. The North Tower began to rise from the foundation. It became harder to reconcile the material reality of what was being built with Yamasaki's humanist philosophy. And within the fraught political context of that summer, the towers became an inescapable symbol of authoritarian power. It was then that Huxtable's confidence in Yamasaki began to waver. The Trade Center towers could be the start of a new skyscraper age or the biggest tombstones in the world, she wrote in the New York Times. Lewis Mumford was writing The Pentagon of Power at the time and compared the project to the Apollo mission. just another extravagant feat of technological exhibitionism. In one of the few illustrations in the Pentagon of Power, shown here, Mumford juxtaposes the plan for the World Trade Center in model form with another Rockefeller-sponsored self-destructing machine, homage to New York. Mumford, of course, is tapping into an undertone of violence that had existed since the first skyscrapers, decades before Rem Koolhaas wrote about elevators or Virilio wrote about shipwrecks. In 1945, when Yamasaki still lived in New York, E.B. White wrote in his little book, Here's New York, "A single flight of planes no bigger than a wedge of geese can quickly end this island fantasy, burn the towers, crumble the bridges, turn the underground passages into lethal chambers." All right, these are ads from... By October of 1970, Yamasaki's North Tower was the tallest building in the world. And after the second tower topped out, its engineer, Leslie Robertson, snapped this photograph, which so brilliantly illustrates the kind of engineering of the building. Artists living in the shadow of the towers also began to track their progress. Paul Tech would watch them from his East Village window, and he called them Sodom and Gomorrah. Pierre Defanil, on the left, took this photograph of, you can see there's a silhouette of a dog in the foreground, and this is Andre Cortez's photograph with that kind of lone pigeon that would eventually become the cover of Don DeLillo's book, Underworld. Gordon Matta Clark on the left, who was himself a twin, had this kind of incredible fascination with these buildings, and this is a photograph from Tei-Ching Sei's one-year project on the beach, which I'll get to shortly. The photograph on the left here is by Baldwin Lee, and the right is Thomas Struth. So it's kind of constantly being documented, and it's also this recurring presence in the work of Isa Genskin, who proposed these models for rebuilding in 2008. As the South Tower of the World Trade Center climbed to meet its twin, conditions at Period Igo were deteriorating rapidly. It became a case study in failed housing policy, and by the 1960s, there were more sociologists than maintenance workers working on the campus. Books like Lee Rainwater's Behind Ghetto Walls and Oscar Newman's Defensible Space began to take hold of the narrative. And in January 1970, uninsulated pipes froze throughout the buildings, leaving residents without heat and water for days and causing widespread damage. With the same zeal that previous administrations had pointed to Period Igo as a triumph of housing reform, the Nixon administration presented the project as a symbol of welfare state socialism, and in October 1971, they ordered it torn down. The result was a televised spectacle presented as a referendum on misguided policy. The demolition was broadcast on national television. This photograph, which is in fact one of three nearly identical photographs, established Period Igo's place in architectural history. When the World Trade Center finally opened just a few months later on a rainy April morning in 1973, Ada Louise Huxtable's final review was a devastating rebuke. Yamasaki had tried for something special, she wrote, but the result was nothing but General Motors Gothic, populist, provincial, and corporate. Yama wrote a meticulous 7-page rebuttal to Huxtable, to which she ultimately responded, "You are the architect, and I am the critic, and this is an honest parting of the ways." It's a heartbreaking exchange. And essentially the end of their relationship. They have one more communication later. But by 1976, the World Trade Center was losing $20 million a year. Despite these financial woes, the towers had become a symbol of excess at a time when the rest of the city was falling into disrepair. The New York Times speculated cynically that if the World Trade Center were to suffer the fate of Period Igo, death by dynamite, many of us would cheer, but good fortune comes rarely. It was around this time, it was around this time that Fred Conrad took the image that's on the cover of this book. This was taken shortly after the sand that you see here is now Battery Park City, and the construction for Battery Park City, which was all built on made land, was paused when the city nearly went bankrupt. And now this is May of 1977, so it's the very beginning of what would be the summer of Sam, the summer of the Bronx fires. The city had narrowly avoided bankruptcy, but by the end of the 1970s, 40% of the South Bronx had been destroyed by fire. 250,000 people had lost their homes. And it was ultimately the financial sector, not the government, that bailed the city out. When Felix Reuten's crisis regime effectively took control of the city, New York kind of emerged from bankruptcy, not as an industrial city that it had once been, but as a city kind of built for the information economy. And by the time this photograph was taken in 1983, you can see that the buildings in Battery Park City are beginning to come up. The Trade Center had assumed sort of a new identity. It was no longer a symbol of the port or of the industrial city. It became sort of an icon of financial excess. It was on the cover of Bright Light's Big City the same year. It was what Baudrillard had called the effigy of the capitalist system. And at this point, Fiorello LaGuardia's vision of New York as a worker's paradise built around a thriving port had died, and the city had reemerged on its way to what Mayor Bloomberg would describe in 2003 as a luxury product. This is another image taken from the very end of that, the southern tip of that beach. This is Agnes Dennis's project, Wheatfield, in which she planted an acre of wheat on what's now the World Financial Center, or whatever it's called. When Jean-Paul Sartre visited Manhattan for the first time, he wrote of a city for the far-sighted, where there's nothing to focus upon except the vanishing point. The first time I managed to get inside 432 Park, it was still under construction. Outside of its north-facing windows, the entirety of Central Park unfolds before you, and the parallel axes of Park and Madison Avenues recede towards a vanishing point somewhere beyond the Harlem River. These perspectival lines converge in New York's 15th congressional district, which covers most of the South Bronx and is the poorest per capita in the country. New York's 12th congressional district, which covers the Upper East Side, including this building, is the richest. And this slender tower makes it possible to see both ends of that vast financial spectrum. It was perhaps with this expanse in mind that Raphael Vignoli told a reporter, without irony, that New York has increasingly become a city where there are only two markets, ultra-luxury and subsidized housing. The most distinctive building from Yamasaki's late career was the Rainier Bank Tower in Seattle, a 41-story office block balanced precariously on a flared pedestal on a prominent downtown site. Huxtable thought it was a crime against nature, writing, some buildings are built, others, such as this, are perpetrated. The unanimous condemnation of Rainier suggests something about how the critical consensus around Yamasaki's work had begun to calcify, but it was a single short paragraph in Charles Jenks's The Language of Postmodern Architecture, published the same year, that had the most enduring impact on his legacy. And there's one sentence in particular. Modern architecture died in St. Louis on July 15th, 1972 at 3:32 p.m. or thereabouts, when the infamous Pruitt-Igoe scheme, or rather several of its slab blocks, were given the final coup de grace by dynamite. Boom, boom, boom. And what's really remarkable about this paragraph, which is among the most famous paragraphs in the history of American architecture, is that Jenks got the time wrong, he got the date wrong, he got the number of stories wrong, and he suggests that Yamasaki won an award he in fact didn't win. But it doesn't matter, because what he realized is that he had the image, right? And the image is what makes this such an important event. And there's no doubt the buildings failed, but I don't think any architectural solution could have overcome the larger social and political forces that made the demise of Pruitt-Igoe inevitable. And many of the residents who grew up on the land where Pruitt-Igoe was built had now seen their neighborhood razed not once, but twice, and they were the ones who bore the brunt of its failures. When the last residents left Pruitt-Igoe, the housing authority gave many of them vouchers to subsidize rentals in one St. Louis suburb, in particular, Ferguson. So in August of 2014, when police in Ferguson shot and killed Michael Brown, the journalist and former Pruitt-Igoe resident Sylvester Brown drew a direct line between the two events. Be it by design, accident, or benign neglect, the fuse that led to the explosion in Ferguson was lit in St. Louis more than 60 years ago. Yamasaki died on February 6, 1986, from complications related to stomach cancer. He was 73. When the Detroit Free Press asked Paul Goldberger for a comment to include in Yama's obituary, he told them he did a number of very prominent buildings, even if they didn't change the course of architecture. I think time has proven Goldberger wrong. Neither Pruitt-Igoe nor the World Trade Center will be remembered as masterpieces, nor should they be. But it's hard to imagine another pair of buildings which in their lifespan have exerted a greater influence on the course of American architecture. Architecture moves slowly. It rarely produces events. And it's difficult to imagine any two events that have shaped the culture and politics of modern architecture in the last 80 years more than the story told by the handful of photographs of Pruitt-Igoe tumbling to the ground or the thousands of images of the World Trade Center collapsing under its own weight. With 20 years of distance from 9/11, I hope we might all be able to see these two buildings, which have become such an unfortunate icon of American unilateralism and xenophobia, instead as the product of the imagination of a man who had to overcome extraordinary obstacles to design them and believed, however quixotically, in their potential to be symbols of something quite the opposite of what they've come to represent. I hope it might also be an opportunity to move Yamasaki's legacy away from Pruitt-Igoe and the World Trade Center and onto those projects that have had a real and enduring influence on contemporary architecture. These are just two examples, but the image on the left is a catalog showing McGregor that I took a photograph of inside Rem Koolhaas's Central Library in Seattle, which is a building that was built basically 2 blocks from where Yamasaki grew up, and you can see how beautifully the mullions align in the ceiling of the two buildings. And this, of course, is McGregor on the top with David Agee's building, David Agee's Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., which is admittedly of a very different scale, but the influence, I think, is undeniable and one that David acknowledges. Okay. I have remarked to students on several occasions how 9/11 defined everything about the culture and politics of the first 20 years of my adult life, in much the same way that the first 20 years or 10 years of the lives of students who may be here or may be listening will likely be informed by the increasingly urgent and often indistinguishable demands of public health and of climate change. And so perhaps the parts of this book that deal with illness and the limitations of the human body might be more relevant to you even than the parts about Yamasaki. At least I hope I've been able to propose a perspective in the book from which it's possible to consider the idea of sick building syndrome in a new light. You know, we've dispensed with the term, but there's still sick buildings. And I think if we allow ourselves to apply the term more broadly, it might inform our reading of events like the fire at the Grenfell Tower in London in 2017, or this year's collapse of the Champlain Towers in Surfside, both of which suggest to me an approach to building construction, development, and zoning that prioritizes profit over human well-being. Yamasaki may not have always succeeded in his efforts to humanize modern architecture, but he was not afraid to fail trying, and I think there's a great deal to be learned from looking back at that work with an open mind. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Just a comment on the criticism of Yamasaki and of the architecture and so on was going on at the same time with the criticism of Saarinen, basically because they were both here in the Midwest and they weren't the Eastern or
Right.
establishment. So he faced a different criticism, but it was just as idiotic
No, it's true. And in this particular case of Scully, who I'm writing about,
Yeah.
Scully had the awkward problem of having to somehow accommodate Saarinen because there were multiple buildings on campus, right? So he had to sort of allow him in reluctantly in the side. But you could tell from the way he spoke about him that he was equally critical. And it's one of the sort of tragedies of Saarinen's early death is you didn't kind of get to see how both of those careers would have evolved beside each other. But I think it's a good point. And yeah.
Just an aside, Yama used to visit the Saarinen office all the time.
Yeah, no, of course. You were there.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Yes?
There was an article, and somebody was commenting about how the new condos being built have bedrooms without windows. And so when you're talking about sick buildings,
Right.
it's like, why is this evolved to the point where they think they can have a bedroom without windows and that it's okay, it's healthy?
I mean, I think one of the silver linings of what we've gone through in the last 2 years is it has really kind of put a magnifying glass on the way that buildings impact respiratory health and public health and personal health. And I think you're right. It like how do you get to a point where you're like, oh yeah, it makes sense for people to live without windows? No, of course it doesn't. But I think it'll be interesting to see if COVID can kind of change our awareness of the environments that we live in, that we share with other people, the ventilation, things like that, moving forward. I hope it does. Anyone else? Good, keep going. Come on, give me another.
Talking about the criticism of architecture's decoration, and it seemed to us at the time, not just me, but that Arrow had strong conceptual architecture,
Mm-hmm.
and the concept drove the design. So, like it's been highly recently said, or continually said, the design changed all the time because the concept of the building changed all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yamasaki basically developed a vocabulary, so it wasn't as deep, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
deep as a result of a concept, although his concept for the high-rise was strong. It got the same clothing every time.
Right.
And so that's what separated them.
Yeah, no, and I think that there are instances where that's a very valid criticism, right? Where there is sort of a decorative treatment to the exterior of a building, but then there are also buildings like Reynolds where I think it's totally magnificently integrated and every bit of it is completely functional, And I think one of the things that's as a person who makes things, that was so interesting to me in getting to know this body of work better, is that Yamasaki's story is not one of constant success or constant failure. He's trying all these things and he fails, and there's a lot of buildings that aren't very good, and he admitted them, which no architect would ever do, right? He would say, I built a lot of real dogs. And so, but this idea of just, it's part of, I think, what made him such a sympathetic character for me is this way in which he's trying to put these ideas out in the world, and sometimes they land and sometimes they don't, and he's kind of learning from it. And there's this kind of specter of failure that hangs over his career primarily because of these two projects that ended in so spectacularly. But the truth of the matter is he was an incredibly prolific architect who built so many buildings all over the country, all over the world. Yeah, sorry.
Two things. Both of them were wonderful master, and the people they had with them, master craftsmen detailers.
Yes.
The buildings, the architects of the time were nowhere near the kind of development that both of them, and you could see in McGregor,
Hmm.
the detailing is extraordinary, and today good as when it was done. So, and Arrow's office did the same thing. And I think what disappointed, or what Yama kind of stopped doing is didn't put up or mention his Reynolds aluminum and McGregor and so on were wonderful concepts, wonderful ideas, wonderful. And then he came upon the Gothic curtain wall,
Yeah.
thing, and he began to use it over and over
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
And that's where I think he began to lose out on this inventiveness he had, which is just as good as any architect, of his time.
True. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else?
And just